Hi, welcome back to the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. I'm your host, Doug O'Brien. My guest today is Charles Faulkner. I've been trying to get Charles on this podcast for quite some time. Charles has been around NLP as long as there has been NLP, as far as I know. He's an internationally recognized cognitive behavioral modeler, a speaker, innovator, training specialist in situation analysis, decision making. He tells me he's had like 5 different careers, so I believe him. I don't see any reason why he'd lie about that, but I know him most for, at least I first heard of him from his book, NLP, The New Technology of Achievement, which he wrote, I think, back in the 90s with Steve Andreas. He can correct me about that if I'm wrong. But nevertheless, I have a very special reason for asking him here. He was one of the first people that I know of who went to Dave Dobson up in Friday Harbor, not just to learn from him, but to model him. When I went, I was a fledgling. I was just learning NLP. I was just learning the stuff. He went as a full-fledged NLP modeler in order to model Dave Dobson, and I want to find out what he found out. So that's why he's here, and let's get started with the podcast. You are listening to the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast, a show devoted to uncovering the systems and the secrets that set the best apart, where you learn how to take your coaching clients to the next level, while you grow the coaching practice of your dreams. So sit back and relax, or sit up and get excited. Either way, you might want to pay attention. This could be important. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, just correct me if I'm wrong. You're in Michigan?
No, I'm in Illinois. I'm actually north of Chicago near the lake.
Oh, okay, great. Nice. How's the weather out there?
It's sunny today, which is good. I'm close enough to the lake. I've known this, that close enough to the lake that I get the lake effect, which means more snow in the winter if there is snow, which we've had once. But what it means is that when the land cools in the winter, we actually get a warmer temperature by 10 or more degrees because the water stays warmer longer.
All right.
And in the spring, of course, the land warms up first, but the lake keeps it cooler. So it's a very interesting place to live. I like that about it.
I am similarly from a Great Lake city. I'm from Buffalo, but we're on the other side of the water mass. So our lake effect tends to be like massive snow, because when it comes across the warmer lakes, it picks up all the moisture. And when it hits the colder land, it just drops it. Sometimes like 4 or 5. If you ever watched a Buffalo Bills game in the wintertime, you know what I'm talking about. It's just like mounds of snow. And but still very, very temperate temperatures in the summertime. It's a lovely place to be from. Anyway, that's not why we're here, Charles.
No, but it speaks to the idea that environment is important to me. And I pay attention to that as one of the key factors that I feel that's left out of all sorts of change management kind of situations. And when I say environment, I'm speaking beyond the immediate environment or the people involved, but the larger systems as they go out. So you very graciously introduced me as a modeler. And one of the projects I took on years ago was modeling context. How that affects things. So our conversation can go in a lot of directions. One small correction is that I was the organizer and principal author of the audio tape set called New Technology of Achievement, NLP, the New Technology of Achievement, which was from the early 90s with 5 or 6 other trainers of NLP Comprehensive.
Okay.
We put that together, and then we were approached by Nightingale Conant to turn that audio set into a book. And the authors got on board and they wrote their chapters about what their topics were, whether that was rapport or strategies or state maintenance or change and so forth, with the idea of how can you achieve a goal? What are all the steps that I had noted that would need to be there to have a complete program? So that was actually a modeling of the structure of achievement. Cool. And then Steve came on board, given his considerable skills at editing and authoring books. And he and I became the co-editors that took the chapters of the authors and reworked some of them and wrote some new ones so that we had a complete program.
I see. Thank you for that correction.
Oh yeah, it's now just an artifact, of course, because I'm not on TikTok out there promoting it, but it stands up pretty well for what it was represented to be.
Oh, I thought it literally was one of my favorite books of NLP for a long, long time. Probably still is. Haven't read it in a long time. Who are some of the other authors that are in there?
Tim Halbum and Susie Smith.
Yeah, of course.
Gary Schmidt. So you put me on the spot here, and
that's good. And I forgot about some. Of course,
Kelly Gerling is another one, and Robert McDonald.
All right. Very cool. Very cool. So let's talk about you. I mentioned in the intro that I'm really desperate to hear your take on Dave Dobson, but just to set the stage a little bit more about who you are for our audience who may not have read the Wikipedia page, because by the way, you are one of the few people that I know who has a Wikipedia page. Which is,
you can't write your own. I was actually living in the UK at the time, working with boutique banks, again on another topic, but decision making, but decision making under uncertainty and complexity, which later became the whole behavioral economics thing about irrational decision making and system 1 and system 2, which we might go into because they do bear on this. And so I was doing that then and coaching different people, traders and fund managers over there. And this fellow wrote, he wanted to write my Wikipedia page. And I said, oh, please don't. Of course, no, I encouraged him. And so that's why I have it. Of course, they still say I live in England. You're not allowed to edit your own Wikipedia page.
That's good. So never mind. I won't ask you what part of England do you live in, because that's just a silly question. But decision-making under stress basically is what you're saying. So
very specific decision-making under uncertainty and complexity.
Uncertainty and complexity, and that obviously is very much what traders do. So do you work a lot in that world with traders?
I used to, and yet with the onslaught of automation, and by the way, they've been using AI for years, different versions of it. And so more and more, they don't see that as essential. Moreover, again, with the rise of TikTok and YouTube and so forth, there's all sorts of people, and they claim they can make you a great trader. And I've now talk about that as like the right and left hand of trading, or the right and left hand of investing. And the right hand is to know all these things about the markets and what influences markets and how to investigate cash flow and PE ratios and all that sort of stuff. The left hand, though, is the bigger part. And the left hand is what is known in, behavioral economics, even though they didn't come up with it. It was dual process theory. The bigger part of it is what Dave called the other than conscious, what Milton Erickson called the unconscious, the formation of this aspect of us that has perceptions, responds to those perceptions emotionally, has stories that we tell about things, and that's fundamentally our reasoning process. And then on top of that, a number of us build expertise. And that could be in the legal profession or the trading profession or medicine or engineering, other areas. And that, as was noted in his best-selling book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, that takes a lot of energy, like actually fuel, the glucose in the system. It tires easily. It's disrupted by emotional changes and low blood sugar. And so what happens at that point is that the system will say, I'm making a reasoned response, but it'll grab a solution from the other than conscious, from the unconscious. And it said, well, that's a rational decision. And this is a lot of papers on that now that show that even the best of the people in the finance business and other areas, medicine and so forth, do this without even being aware of it. Which goes back to Dave's claim that things are largely other than conscious. And the conscious kind of floats on top, which is kind of the way it is with the expertise. Yeah,
I love Dave's diagram once. He drew a little diagram, a big, circle pie chart thing, and he just gave this tiny little sliver of consciousness. And he said, your consciousness is a gift from your other than conscious. And all the things that you think of, like, oh, that's me making that decision, that's that little tiny sliver claiming that, but it isn't really coming from that most of the time. It's coming from the other than conscious part. So tell me, how did you come to know about Dave and get up there to model him?
Well, I was taking NLP not at the beginning. I was more second or third generation.
Oh, come on now. What year?
I found out about it in 80 and started training in 81. Or I found
Okay,
out
so
17 or 80.
generation, just Charles, generation.
I know when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I'm aware.
So you were maybe first 0.1
Well, and
generation.
I endeavored to. That was back when you could study with everybody.
Right.
The Mopsing Dotar had already exploded, so Grinder and Bandler weren't working together, and Leslie going off with her group and so forth. But you could still go between the groups, and nobody objected back then.
Right.
So I studied with everybody, and at least that's how it seemed to me. And at one point, I met this guy Eric Oliver. And Oliver was studying with Dave, and he was saying, well, you know, if Milton Erickson was alive, because at that point he wasn't, would you study with him? And Eric, very bright guy. And as I mentioned to you on a previous conversation, somebody that you ought to endeavor to see if you can get to join.
I have endeavored, and it's just been crickets back from Eric.
Well, yeah, and the things, what's interesting is he went into the legal profession, consulting, because he wasn't making a living being either a trainer or a therapist. And I don't mean that pejoratively. It's just like, who knows to want what he had to offer?
Yeah.
It's not your typical offer. And so he did find a receptive audience among trial attorneys. And you can get his books. He's got several out. He's really created a body of work. And it doesn't seem like it's Dave, but if you read kind of in between the lines, and sometimes right on the line, you can tell that it's very much influenced by Dave and by Eric's own brilliance and contributions.
Yeah.
So
I would agree. I've only read one of his books, and even then it was a little bit over my head, frankly, for what I'm not in the legal profession, but I did endeavor to get the most of it. And I noticed what you're talking about, that there's a lot of Dave in between the lines and sometimes right on the lines. So so Eric was your inspiration to go out there. So you said,
almost, he said, you've got to go. So I went out there several times. And then would be a point where Eric would come over to me and he would gesture in some odd way, which we'll get into. And then he'd say, Dave wound you up again. And he said, oh, thank you. And I'd take a deep breath, let it out slow. Yeah. And really, Dave didn't, I actually tell people, I told Joseph Campbell I wanted to model him and explain what it was. He said, well, I look at books and underline things. That wouldn't be interesting to you. Oh, okay. What was interesting to me when I went to a lecture of Joseph Campbell was he could start anywhere and end anywhere in terms of representational systems. And he would, if the person asked him a question in the auditory, he would answer in the auditory, go to the visual, go to the kinesthetic. Or he could mix it up. I hadn't met anybody that was that flexible before.
Wow.
That was really interesting.
Very interesting.
So I met Dave and I said I wanted to model him, and he was like, typical Dave kind of reaction. Yeah. But I went to the seminar. I paid the price. I did the exercises. I was, polite. And so I arrived at some things that are very much what Dave said. And then I've also made some inferences from what he did, given my background and my endeavors to become that thing that my principal employment moniker would be cognitive behavioral modeler, but who knows to want that,
there's a long line out your door waiting for. Kind of like a big dose of that cognitive behavioral modeling, please.
But I just to say, I got called into IBM to help set up a division. And another time I was called up by Hewlett Packard to come in and model how people did software testing.
So how did they? Well, never mind. I don't want to know how they knew to ask you that. I want to stick to Dave.
Well, I'm just saying that at that time, software testing, 90% of software programs never made it to completion because there were errors in the code that prevented that. So it was a real deal to go in and model out the best guy in the industry there. I got to the end of that though, and then I was the person who knew more about that than anybody else in Silicon Valley. Going, but I don't want that as my job. So just so we know, let people know. So modeling in the NLP world is that the idea of modeling is that you can look at anybody's system's way of doing things, their visual accessing cues, the way they speak, the way they move, the way they talk, the beliefs they have about things. You can take that on for yourself. You can do the same things that they're doing and essentially get the same results that they're getting. That's the idea, at least. So Bandler and Grinder modeled
Milton Erickson, they modeled Virginia Satir, they modeled Fritz Perls, they modeled these people, Frank Fairley, to get their ways of doing things. And a lot of times it was very much reliant on their unconscious mind. So Bandler and Grinder would be like talking like Fritz Perls and his sort of Austrian accent thinking that was important. So there's the modeling, right? Stroking their beard, which they didn't have. And yeah, so you learned modeling from Bandler and Grinder?
Yeah, I took as I understand, the only modeling course Bandler ever offered. It was 2 weeks with his group. And I took a 2-week modeling course with John Grinder, in which Robert Diltz was one of the lead people that was doing that.
Wow. Cool.
And I also studied experiential array with David Gordon.
I love that stuff. David's brilliant. I love that.
He is, yeah. So I went, and also then because you could study everybody, I studied hypnosis with Stephen Gilligan and Paul Carter in those days.
Cool. Yeah.
And I also went to Robert Shaw seminar on contextual therapy.
I don't even know who that is. Robert Shaw, I thought he was a choral director, wasn't he?
Yeah. Different
Robert Shaw.
So, it's like that was really cool. It was like there was a sense of real excitement.
Huh.
And I still remember the time David Gordon came in to teach a master's program on their imprint method or some such thing.
Yeah.
And then he got up and on the second day he came in and he says, I was talking to Leslie last night. Oh, cool. And like the 150 of us looked up and he tore down all the flip charts of the previous days. He says, I've rethought this whole thing.
Oh, shit.
And that was my point to who's ever watching, listening. That was very exciting because in those days, it wasn't the idea that if what you're doing with the client doesn't work, you try something else. If what yours isn't doing, do anything else. In that day, it was if your model isn't working, get another model. And I still have that, and that was one of the motivations to go see Dave, because he clearly had a different appreciation of the discoveries of Grinder and Bandler than they did. In fact, a number of people who've probably been there have already told you this, is he was quite vocal about that.
Yeah.
Is that he was like, well, Grinder and Bandler discovered the alphabet. He seemed kind of impressed. He was impressed by that. He says, but they don't know how to write poetry. And
that's a quote I've never heard before.
Oh my. Yeah, that was one of the things he was saying the time I was there. Several times.
Cool, love it.
And I think I agree with him, because at that point they had basically a Fortran linear processing model. Probably picked that up in college with the loop back and so forth.
Yep.
And Dave was noticing something else with a lot of simultaneity to it, and more about certain kinds of relationships between rep systems that we'll get into.
So let's get into some of that. I know we have limited time because of technical issues before, but can you explain, and maybe this is jumping the gun, so if you want to set some more stage, please don't answer this question in the way that I'm asking it. But can you explain how Dave did what he referred to as the reversal? Yeah,
with a lot of preface.
Okay. Can you do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, first, is the idea of the representational systems.
I'm sorry, I misread. It's the subjective reversal.
Yeah, subjective reversal. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
And that is the idea that this is what's foundational to our experience. And we have the visual and the visual and the auditories and the kinesthetics, and that these different ways of preferencing, gathering information, even though we are synesthetic organisms, we're multimodal, we take it in through all senses, but there are preponderances. I don't use dominance because then I want to know who the submissive is. So there's a preponderances of some aspect that's more attentive, or has, the way I think about it, has more distinctions in it.
Okay.
So someone who's an artist, visual artist, they see more visual distinctions because they practice to get those.
Right.
Whereas someone who's more auditory oriented, whether that's a language or music or something, they're actually making more distinctions. You can think of them as having a larger gathering area than they might have in the kinesthetics. Now, a couple of things, this might be from NLP, might be from Dave. I'm not sure my memory back then now, but there's your preponderant, as I call it, not dominant, preponderant representational system is the one that you use most often. which Dave claimed was auditory, and I think he's right, at least in this culture. And then there's your primary, which is to say your first. Again, language is slippery here, but what's the one you take in information from? And then on the back end, there is, not necessarily on the back end, but then there's the evaluative. Now, I later on worked out in some of the papers I sent you that there's some 6 kinesthetics, different neurological pathways for them. But Dave was speaking primarily of the evaluative autonomic gut kinesthetic, or as he referred to it, the uncomfortable feeling would be another example of that.
Along the midline, exactly.
Right. Well, that's an example. Also, a gut reaction is an example. Intuition is an example. All those are examples of autonomic reactions to a complex in another representational system. So, curiously, people are unaware of their most developed system. Or in the words of Virginia Satir, I see myself as a feeling person.
Right.
And my own example was that, I would see myself as a modeler. Well, that's the one that's in my awareness. Actually, the most preponderant one is auditory. And of course, this clearly can be displayed by the curve in my neck, the gesture I use, the fact that I have a fluid voice. There's all these cues that are in addition to the language, like that sounds good, that rings true.
Sure.
Bell. So the typical NLP, there's also the physiology. Also in the physiology, less taught in the NLP than the I-axis and cues. Oh, by the way, the I-axis and cues can do something like this. If somebody really has been trained in life to look at somebody and then they want to access something, they might go like that. And
very good.
Axis and cues. So
nice.
This I worked out while I was modeling people and noticing there were all these variations on it.
Mm.
And then, of course, there's the nonverbals.
Let me just stop you a quick second, Charles. So people who are only listening to this recording, what we're talking about with accessing cues in the NLP world is that the person accesses their visual modality. They tend to look up, either to the left or to the right. They just up, basically. They're talking about the sounds, the things that they're paying attention to auditorily, tend to be along the horizontal line, from ear to ear kind of thing. And if they're kinesthetic, they're down to the right usually. What Charles was just demonstrating visually is that some people would keep their eyes focused on one level, then they tilt their head down, their chin down, so basically their eyes are now looking up, even though they're keeping looking right at you. They could move their head around from side to side to get the same access, but they keep their eyes focused one direction and just move their head to get the other access. So just for those only listening, that was an auditory description of what Charles just demonstrated visually.
Now, I did something else. I did this. I did my hand marking places across in front of me. That's multimodal, obviously. It also tends to be something an auditory would do. Like an auditory will count off something on their fingers. Auditory, of course, is stroking the chin. Curiously, it's like stroking the chin when it's their internal dialogue, pointing at their ear when they're listening to something. Again, you can see these very obvious cues if you're looking. And then the whole palms thing, palms down, as I'm showing right now, pointing the finger at something. Satir category calls that a blamer. That's somebody who at that moment is preponderantly visual. Or if someone is like stroking the chin or pointing at the ear or talking, then they're being they are in preponderance of auditory. And then as far as the autonomic nervous system kinesthetic, palms so that you're like juggling something like oranges or something, or touching yourself or hugging somebody else. These are all very strong signs. Hugging yourself, hugging somebody else. These are very body indicators also of that kind of kinesthetic.
Yes.
Now, these are 3 neurolinguistic operators. I've only actually given 2. I mentioned the 3rd one. The neurolinguistic operator in the face movements and the eye movements, more the eye movements, the body movements and clues, and then the language the person uses. Is this clear to you? Does this sound good? Do you have a feeling for what I'm talking about?
Got it. Can you grasp this?
Right. Now, those 3 operators, this gets into Dave's idea of congruence. What I just did is I did them in all 3 channels. That is, I did them with my eyes, I did them with my words, and I did them with my gestures. And that was Dave's definition of you're being congruent. You're actually doing each representation of the experience fully in each representational system as you move through the strategy.
Yeah, and Dave used to give us this really great exercise. I don't know if you remember this one, but he would ask us to tell a 1-minute story that was just a neutral story. It didn't have any, emotional weight either way. It wasn't a great story or a sad story. It was just, dull, everyday story, how I went and bought a loaf of bread at the grocery store. But tell that 1-minute story congruently visually. So all your word choices, all your eye patterns, everything was visual. And then to say the same exact story, but translate it across systems to a congruently auditory representation, and then do it the same way in a congruently kinesthetic way. I think that's one of the best exercises I ever learned to do. It has really developed my ability to be congruent, but also to be flexible, to do a little bit like what you described Joseph Campbell being able to do.
Yeah, and it's curious when you go to do it, you really do find out you have your own preponderance.
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, I kind of got there that time.
Man, I tried to. I was doing a storytelling class recently when I tried to demonstrate it. It just, my visuals sucked. It was just horrible. But I got the idea across, but it was just not at all congruent.
Well, and this goes to the idea that you've got an audience, another person, whatever, and you're endeavoring to do this communication through all systems. Again, we're multimodal creatures,
right?
So that they can pick up wherever they are and get that.
Sure.
And there's another one, by the way, that I noticed is that there's, and I'm sure Dave knew this, he just didn't emphasize it. Grinder emphasized it, but it was confusing to people, which is there's your kinesthetic autonomic nervous system, and there's your kinesthetic proprioceptive system.
You're going to have to explain that.
And you may have noticed when I said proprioceptive, I tightened the muscles on my body while also looking down into my kinesthetic.
I noticed the looking down part. I didn't notice the tightening of the muscle. But go ahead.
I'm overdoing it. So what Grinder claimed was that really effective learners would see somebody do something, and then they would do it in their own body until they felt they had a pretty good match, and then be feeling for that match. In other words, matching up in the autonomic nervous system. So that was a kinesthetic proprioceptive to a kinesthetic emotion, as opposed to the idea of having an auditory to a kinesthetic.
Okay.
And the thing is, that actually is the new behavior generator. Which is where you take on the external behavior of the person.
Sure.
Because, and it's interesting how this has come out in mirror neurons and the rest, is that we actually in the face. This is, by the way, they discovered this with people with Botox.
I know that. I was debating whether I should mention this or not, but yeah, exactly. I know this study. Go ahead.
Yeah, and people who have Botox are really bad at inferring what other people are feeling and thinking.
Yeah.
And sometimes bad at it anyway, but people with Botox are especially bad at it. And what they worked out is we actually are unconsciously modeling the other person.
Yeah. If I may, just very, very quickly, and I promise I'll be real quick for people who want to hear Charles and not me. They did a study where people were shown images of a variety of people that they disguised the study by saying, we just want to see if it's cross-cultural, if you can tell the people in Japan or India or China, whatever, would have the same sort of general expressions as other human beings all around the world. So they showed like 50 pictures of the people. Can you tell what emotion this person is feeling? And so they become like, okay, well, he's mad, or he's surprised, or he's angry, or, but they noticed they had a camera on these people that they were mirroring the image on the screen every time. So they were doing the little surprise thing, even for a nanosecond. They were like doing the surprised look on their face so that they could feel what the person was feeling. They could feel the surprise feeling. Then they did the same study with people with Botox injections in their face, and they couldn't get anything. They were just 0 for 0. I mean, it was 0-50. It was terrible. You couldn't respond because their face wasn't moving in the way that the picture was being moving.
This also is backed up by Ekman's work in micro expressions.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And so in terms of Dave would play this game and where he'd make noises. So when I open a training or I have a group of bankers or something, and I would, wave my hand around or I'd tighten my muscles, and I could see by the unconscious responses, the other than conscious responses in the room, who had picked up on what I'd just done.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, at least as I modeled it out, this was part of Dave saying hello to the other than conscious. In other words, that part of the person was paying attention, especially when one congruently expressed that. And then, that was the entry. And then the idea, you said hello unconsciously, they would do something, you'd respond back with that. And when they did that, then, you didn't need the, go deeper and deeper into a trance, because you were already connecting.
Got it.
As I understood.
Yeah.
All of this is my inference, is what Dave said and did. So with that grain of salt or many more, I offer this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things, obviously, I think that Dave and Milton had in common, which is they didn't really teach cognitively or like straight ahead. They didn't teach something. Here's what you're going to do now. They just demonstrated it and did it on you. But if you didn't figure it out, then that was on your own. It was on you.
So the idea of that sliver you talked about earlier, what I talked about, the part floating on top. And by the way, the floating on top is even interesting, because when you have an expertise, whether it's mathematics and engineering, or whether it's how to do surgery or whatever, those become part of system one when they automate. In other words, you hope your surgeon is not trying to remember where he or she's supposed to be cutting when they're doing that. I mean, that's already an entrained unconscious behavior. They're paying attention at another level to what they're doing. So even these things that we think of as being expertise that we consciously run are largely unconscious, are largely other than conscious. Where this gets interesting for me is that, because this is I made this up, because we're talking to ourselves as we're doing it. And of course, that's the most important representational system. Then
Says the auditory. Go ahead.
Right. This goes to Ian McGilchrist's book, The Emissary and His Servant, and the idea that the left brain took over what was supposed to be the right brain's job.
Oh, wow. Did you ever read the Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral?
Well, yeah, that's also a really interesting one that ought to come back onto people's reading list. Yeah.
Sounds very similar to that.
Well, in this one, McGilchrist goes more into detail about how it isn't simply that the right brain is visual and the left brain is auditory. It isn't that simple, but there are real differences in how they understand information, and has to do a lot more with scope, meaning how much they take in, and how they get that information and sort that information. And he's got several long books now. He's written another couple recently.
Stroking my chin there, by the way.
Yeah, the point is that you can actually get some videos online that are 15 to 30 minutes that'll explain this. And it's well worth it, because the depth of what's in the rep system, which I think Dave had I don't know if he knew it, consciously, but he had a real appreciation for it. The qualitative differences in these systems and how they interacted.
Nice. Tell me the name of the book one more time.
It was The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist.
Ian McGilchrist. Okay, I'll
Yeah.
look that up.
Yeah.
There's videos by Ian McGilchrist.
Videos that he's done and videos people have done about his work. So.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Sure.
So, getting back to Dave and the subjective reversal.
Well, we're not even, we're right at the point now where we're going, okay, so all of this is largely outside of conscious awareness, all this stuff that's going on. However, it is irrationally rational, to quote from one of the behavioral economists, that is the Erickson, the economist, that is that it isn't random and it isn't anti-logical. It has its own kind of logic. And this was the work that Daniel Kahneman brought forward with System 1, System 2. And I bring this up because System 1, in their way of thinking about it, is highly organized, makes certain kind of logical errors, which actually what the book is misleading in one sense, and he says so, though people don't get it, is that he and his colleague Amos Tversky, when they were investigating this in the 70s and 80s and 90s, is that they separated the System 2 which is expertise, and the system one in order to study them, but in fact, they're quite intertwined. Mm. They're actually quite involved with each other, but they found ways of separating in certain logical errors that the system one will make. But
could you just describe, you can give a definition of system one, system two, because I missed
well,
that.
that's what I'm getting at, is that system one is actually highly intelligent. It operates by being perceptual and instantaneous, like you recognize me as a person. You can see I have a plant behind me. You don't have to think, what is that? Oh, that's a plant. There's the windows. In other words, this is system one. It's perceptual, it's instantaneous, it's more emotional, it's more visual. There's different qualities about it.
Okay.
And then these qualities, which, and then going to Erickson now, he said that the unconscious mind was benign or beneficially oriented. And you go to the work of Eric Burns, another one who talked about the little professor, this child aspect that people were really unaware of. And called him little professor because it was really smart in the way that somebody was who was making those kinds of decision processes. So, and of course, Dave as well, great respect for the other than conscious. And then system two is conscious, it's deliberative, it goes step by step. It's more auditory. And this is also where, as I say, we hear ourselves saying it. So it's conscious, whereas the other one's other than conscious. And so we go, well, this must be the part that's in charge.
Right.
A mistake of several hundred years, And even more curious, I was just reading some work on the nature of touch, which we won't go into today. It's a whole new investigation I'm into. But the slightest bit about this is that Plato, who came first in the Greek philosophy, he looked up and he was thinking that what was truly amazing were these forms, if you know, the Platonic solids, and that these were like the ideals of the universe. Right. Whereas Aristotle, in an essay that most people overlook, said that no, touch was most important. It was most basic. It was closest to the body. Whereas the philosophy of the time was that the heavens are eternal and unchanging, and the earthly stuff is in decay. And so this prejudiced people not to notice the body for thousands of years. And of course, early and late Christianity didn't help either. The body's sinful and all these things that have kept people away from well, they're right there. I mean, Dave was seeing, that's why he said that he could see the alphabet in action.
Right. Yeah, and that's also why Dave was so anti-Freud.
I'm one of those people who think that Freud was abused, even by Freud.
I know, but Dave made a thing about it. It's like, and I'm the person that's going to take us away from all Freudian concepts of the unconscious being a seething bed of unrealized, he was going to take us somewhere else, which was great. And I agree to a large point. I think Freud was a genius and had a lot of contributions to the field, obviously. But I think
it wasn't unconscious. I mean, he wasn't the only one, but he sold it. Right. So,
as Dave said, he was the greatest hypnotist of all time because he convinced generation after generation of people that what you really needed to do is Freudian therapy to understand.
I'm going to be doing a little side trip here. That's really curious to me because Freud based his therapy on Aristotle's theory of drama, poetics, that it was catharsis. The reason that you needed to talk about your problems was that then you would have a catharsis, like happened in a Greek play when you were observing a Greek play, and then that would release you from it.
Oh, interesting.
His whole premise was actually literary, and he admits as much. He wrote these letters to Felice, which of course I would have read. And in the letters to Felice, he's explaining this whole theory about how he's really talking about helping people redraft the narratives of their life.
Oh, how interesting.
Which is damn curious to me because it was students of Erickson and a couple of people out of Australia and New Zealand that started something called narrative therapy. And also Jerome Berner, one of the great founders of cognitive psychology, that brought the idea that maybe the stories we tell ourselves have an oversized impact on what we believe and what we notice on with the world. Well, again, this stuff in dual process theory is, system one is a story creating system. And if there's any gap in something, it'll fill it with a story. And the story it'll have characteristics that are simple, clear, vivid, familiar, and focal. It'll be a simple story so that you can follow it. And by the way, that's the 7 plus or minus 2 from years ago. Mm-hmm. And they'll be clear, meaning that you don't want a lot of ambiguity in the story. I mean, the thing is, people love ambiguity when it's in the movies, but they hate it in their own lives. They want to know, well, do you like me or not? So. Yeah. And then it's going to be vivid, which means it'll be in color, and familiar. It needs to relate to some other story. It can't be a completely new story. And of course they aren't, as Joseph Campbell pointed out. We, as a species, we have these stories. Some people say there's 1, some people say there's 5, some people say there's 8, not that many. And here's the other thing, focal.
Focal with an F.
With an F. And what I mean by that, this is my list. What I mean by that is that whatever we're looking at in this system one, other than conscious mind, that's the cause. Causation, like billiards or like the moon circling the earth, that's system 2. That's not how system 1 does causation. System 1 does causation like, well, I'm looking at you and I don't feel good, so you must be the problem.
You're making me mad.
Yes, right there it is. And this has really, I work with lawyers now, and this has really curious implications for the law, because it's like you go, here's the defendant, or it's like focal. Right. And there's this default mechanism. So there's these defaults, there's these biases in our system 1, which help us tremendously to move through the world. And yet, as Dave talked about, and I watched an interview the other day that he did years ago, is that due to the hypnotists around us, like mommy and daddy, and our favorite uncle, and our teacher, or our rabbi, or whatever, and so forth, and these people have inculcated ideas in us. And by the way, this goes right back to Eric Berne. Sure. And the idea that and by the way, he wrote it when he talked about the parent, adult, child, and transactional analysis. Those were not things out there. He talked about it as the archaeopsyche, the neopsyche, and the name for the top one, I don't remember. But the idea was that this was direct knowledge, which would be the little professor gets direct experience. Mm-hmm. It would be the neopsyche, meaning generalizations that we make out of our experience. So if people have a tough childhood, they might make the generalization, the world is tough and I need to really, get out there and stand up for myself, for example. And then the other one are the beliefs and ideas about the world that our parents and others hypnotized us into, that either were not challenged or couldn't be challenged or just never were.
Exactly. This is one of the reasons Dave often said that when people come to him for hypnosis, it's not usually hypnosis that they need, it's dehypnosis, because they've been hypnotized by those, hypnotists from their youth, of their parents or their teachers or their older brother or whatever it might be.
Yeah, mistaken identity.
Yeah, very cool. Hey, Charles, I realize we're coming up to about 45 minutes here for our first part of our interview. So I'm thinking maybe we call this part 1 and take a little break and come back in just a couple minutes. And for you and me, everybody else can come back in a week or so. But do part 2 in just a couple minutes, and you can focus a little bit more on this. How does that sound to you?
Sure. I wouldn't have stopped here, but we can stop here. It works.
If you could just summarize the basic principles of what we've just covered of the systems, dual systems theory, and the dual systems, and then we'll call it break for today.
Okay. Well, I would do a little more than that, but is what I've done over the last maybe more than a decade is I have recast most of the NLP hypnosis and stuff I did with Dave into this dual process theory, because it works so well. And again, and he even says it's wrong. There is no system. There's no system 2, but they appear to be, they're not like different parts in the brain. They're actually different networks in the brain, and obviously interrelated. And that there's a preponderance of this other than conscious system, which is running all the time. And then there's this system 2 of expertise that we apply in limited ways and learn new things with, which is significant. And then when that becomes automated, that becomes part of this system 1. In other words, it becomes part of the unconscious. All this consistent with what Dave was, proposing and had noticed decades before this was even a project.
Yeah.
And so I've used that as a shorthand for organizing these to get to the next step, which is that in that system 1, a lot of stuff, as you noted, is out of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
That is, there's not paying attention to it. I'm not paying attention to my ability to drive right now. I'm not driving. I don't need it right now. It's actually an efficiency strategy. On the other hand, because of certain experiences or ideas, whatever, people often don't have even access to some aspect of that, and it's blocked. In other words, an other than conscious experience or range of it or emotion or something is blocked. And that's where we get into where one might want to intervene, and we'll come back on that.
Okay, sounds perfect. Thank you very much. And we're going to do the outro credits, but we'll see you all again in the next episode. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This has been the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure seeing you again. Hope to see you again real soon. Come back next week when we have another gripping and exciting episode of the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. And if you want to, you can find out more about us, each and every one of us, at essentialcoachingskills.com. Thanks.